So today it's really a privilege to be able to introduce Barry Kosmin to you. He's going to speak on sociological and psychological explanations of anti-Semitism. Barry is currently a research professor of public policy and law at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and he's the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Secularism in Society and Culture. He's also a senior associate of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies here in Oxford. During his career, he's held executive positions at the Institute for Jewish and Policy Research here in London, on the Board of Deputies of the British Jewish Council for Federation, on the Board of Deputies of the British Jewish Community, and on the Council of Jewish Federations in New York. Barry's written many books and articles, has been a leading scholar for decades, and last year he wrote, I think, the first serious assessment, social survey using academic methodology to measure the levels of anti-Semitism on American university campuses and on British campuses. And his findings were shocking in that it confirmed some of our worst fears that anti-Semitism on campus is an increasingly serious problem where students are physically intimidated as well as being intellectually intimidated. And as a footnote, there's a couple of young students here on a summer program from Australia, and we met some Australian Jewish kids yesterday who echoed the same thing, that in Melbourne, Jewish students are not wearing Stars of David or anything that gives away their Jewish identity. And they do not tell their professors that they're Jewish because they think that they'll be graded differently. So it's in Australia, which is a good surprise. So, Professor Kosmin.
Okay,
Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Right, tomorrow I'm going to show you data, right? Stuff up there, and you'll be able to, those of you who are numerate will be able to follow them carefully. Now, I realize this audience is very well versed in the topic of anti-Semitism. And I'm going to go over ground, which I think most of you know. But I hope to provide a new slant by raising some key questions. And these key questions are important if anti-Semitism is to be regarded as a new teaching field at a university. And we have to recognize we have a challenge here. For political, academic, and pedagogic reasons, we need to go, I think, beyond the Jewish history, and we also have to go beyond Holocaust studies. We can't allow the field of anti-Semitism to get boxed in and seeing it actually only its most extreme form with Auschwitz and Nazi genocide. So literally we have to, like yesterday's thing, get out of the ghetto when we're approaching anti-Semitism. Now if we look, if we would locate the study of anti-Semitism in a history department, then for PR reasons, and for most people's perceptions, anti-Semitism will lie in the past, right? And if we, rather than the present, if we locate it in Jewish studies, then it's a Jewish problem and nobody else's problem, and not a wider issue. So you see the kind of issues that face curriculum in a university setting of where to place anti-Semitism as a study. Now, I want to begin, I guess, like we heard before, by being reflexive, if not autobiographical. I believe we're studying a very complicated issue. My approach to the topic, as you'll see, is interdisciplinary and multifaceted. That reflects the academic and intellectual experiences I had as a young man, particularly as an activist opposing anti-Semitism in the 1970s. My first job after receiving my doctorate, and I did it in economics and racial relations in British colonial Africa, of all places, was as director of research of the research department of Board of Deputies in British Jews. There I did the type of social and political research that is now done by the CST, and you're going to go and visit them on Monday, the Community Security Trust. Now, in 1974, before the North Sea oil came on tap, the British economy was in terrible trouble. They had a £50 limit for foreign travel, for foreign currency. There was political instability, and fascists of what was known as the British National Party and the National Front were a rising political and street force in London. They got about 150,000 votes in local elections. Now my job was researching all the enemies of the Jewish community, the organisation, as I said, of these fascist groups, but also their opponents, the SWP, the Social Workers' Party, the Trotskyists, who called themselves the Anti-Nazi League. And they were happy to do a kind of Weimar Republic fighting on the streets between the two groups. As well as the GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students, which already, I guess 40 years ago, was already a force. They were funded by the Iraqis and by Gaddafi, who just come to power in Libya. So, and they, as I say, were forced on British university campuses even then. Now, after doing this for a few years and still keeping in touch with the Jewish community, my next post was with a UK government outfit, which was what in Britain is known as a quanga, a quasi-national government organisation, which gets funded by the government, but you're not a civil servant. So in those days, you still had to sign the Official Secrets Act. I was involved with this Social Science Research Council, it's called today the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council. And I was involved with the research unit on ethnic relations at the University of Bristol. And the directors in order were the social psychologist Henri Tachefeld, some of you may have read of him, Michael Banton, a well-known British sociologist, and then the Marxist emigre South African John Rex. After a few months of him, I moved on to the LSE to work with an anthropologist, Sandra Warman. So what I'm saying is I've got a pretty good view of all the social sciences. The Ruhr agenda was prejudice, discrimination, identity, and boundaries. All right? And a lot of discrimination, what we were looking at that time was discrimination in businesses and in housing. Anyway, the SSRC ran exchanges with a number of different countries, with the CNRS in France and the rest of it. One of them they ran exchanges with was the ethnology section of the Soviet Academy of Sciences under academician Bromley. And part of the job was comparing the Soviet nationalities policy with UK race relations. Bizarre kind of comparison, but civil servants found it very interesting. Around the time of the Sharansky trial, I guess that was in the summer of '78, I was approached by a guy called Moshe the Spy. Actually, he was from the Israel embassy. He was actually a lecturer in geography. He was one of the few guys who'd been to the Soviet Union and had maps. Anyway, he asked me to go. I was going to go to the Soviet Union in the summer of '78. And I spent a few weeks traveling in Ukraine and Russia with a partner that Moshe provided for me, a Russian-speaking graduate student from Sheffield. So we went to tourist sites, we met Apparatchik in my job, and we met, in the evenings we met with Fuseniks, and we delivered invitations and thermal underwear to be sent to the gulags and that kind of stuff. But I did get a very good idea of Jewish life and anti-Semitism in the USSR, by meeting people who were suffering and seeing the country. So later when I moved to America in the mid-80s, I guess, I did some work when I was at the professor in sociology at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I authored a report for the CGF, got back into the Russian kind of stuff, for the Council of Jewish Federations and HIAS, which is the resettlement, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, on the class of '79. This was after '78, we had the Sharansky trial. In '79, as a result of the Helsinki business and Henry Jackson, the Soviets for a time, for about 18 months, let about 70,000 Jews out of the Soviet Union, most of whom went via Vienna to America. And this report was about what happened to them 10 years later, in '89. At that time they were either Russians or, the euphemism was New Americans. So I really have some personal and intellectual knowledge, a number of ways, in terms of, the extremists, the fascists and the communists. So that's a kind of background, and I would say, well, you should take some of what I'm saying seriously. So I'm going to range quite widely in this lecture, So I hope you'll be patient and try to stay with me until the end, because I'm going in a certain zigzag way towards a certain conclusion. Tomorrow, as I say, I'm going to provide you with evidence-based research based on work we've done in Europe and America to support some of the arguments I'm going to make. Now, I said sociological and psychological explanations of anti-Semitism. Now, the first one, obviously, most of you know about, is what we might call the dominant interactionist historicist account of anti-Semitism. And that's the one adopted by Hannah Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951. Explains the role of the Jews in modernity and the development of the nation state, as well as particular aspects of Jewish history and functions in society. Charles' little collection up there, Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity, fits right into that mold. It's largely a socio-economic account, or socio-economic underpinning for the creation of anti-Semitism. So the focus is on social conditions that produce anti-Semitism. So the argument is there's setbacks in the modernizing process, the insecurities and upheavals lead to revolutionary and postmodern and reactionary forces, or whatever you want to call it, all opposing modernity, pick on the Jews. This thesis favors what we might call a scapegoat explanation for anti-Semitism as a handmaiden for wider political agendas. Modernities, and the example is modernities, kind of pseudosciences, social Darwinism and Marxism produced regimes that were anti-Semitic, right? Not necessarily so, but they pick on it. So the bigots, or bigoted politicians, invent false images of Jews to serve their own purposes. Now it's possible to invert the thesis, of course, so that you could say that the antithesis, prosperity and democracy, will do the opposite. There will be a prophylactic. Right? If you want to see that argument, you go to Ruth Wisser, right? Who suggests that anti-Semitism is not an inevitable part of human nature, but a successful political ideology for pre-modern and interwar Europe and the contemporary Arab world. In other words, states having problems and societies with problems pick on people. And democracy and a properly functioning economy is the answer. That's the solution. Then the masses will get proper redress from their rulers and they won't pick on the Jews. In other words, they'll stop transferring their grievances and anger onto minorities, especially Jews. The correlation here, as I'm going to deal later, is to what we might call psychological projection concept of Freud. Okay? That's the argument. Most experts pose, of course, great faith in education as a solution to the problem, as well as this democratic societal improvement kind of thing. And that often takes the place, as we know, of kind of re-education, awareness sessions, encounter groups at the kind of local group level. That's at the micro level rather than the macro level, which is this economic improvement model. So this interactionist kind of thesis raises a number of questions. Given this, do ideas really matter? Ideas are not really important, right? It's all about power and strategies. And furthermore, do social conditions, even if you accept that ideas, do social conditions, that is, throw up ideas, or do ideas create social conditions, right? The environment, once you've got it. You also have to, and so therefore you can apply a kind of interactionist model, ideas and social conditions, or social conditions and ideas. Now, one argument could be that the fallacy that many Jews and Muslims of the world, or any liberal-minded people have, is that educated people are inherently less prejudiced than the uneducated, right? That's an assumption in Western society, right? Racism, nastiness generally, like crime, is commonly associated with what's so-called lower orders. Conventional wisdom holds that prejudice equals ignorance, or ignorance creates prejudice. and therefore can be fought and that's ultimately eradicated through education. More education begets enlightenment. Okay? And I make the stress on enlightenment because it comes out of the Enlightenment era. Adam Smith, 1776, you may have heard of Adam Smith, postulated that, quote, an instructed and intelligent people are always more decent and orderly than an ignorant, stupid one. Right? It's a classic argument, right? Wealth of nations. This belief is a kind of twin version, a worldview that contrasts the physicality and the boorishness of the benighted with the refinement and sophistication of the learned classes. Okay? Both relate to a theory of individual pathology and the mob's proclivity to violence. Right? Lots of, what's his name? All right. In the 1960s and 70s, a lot of historical works on the role of the mob in history, especially in the French Revolution. So the frustrated, the inarticulate, the alienated, and the angry simpleton is juxtaposed with the balanced and mentally healthy scholar, right? Which offsets your problem about Melbourne. The problem with this, which is basically a psychological construct, is that it relies on class prejudice rather than on historical facts. It's a bit of a liberal myth. The educated clergy, Christian clergy in Europe, were not always less cruel than illiterate peasants. Right? Shopkeepers are not necessarily morally superior or better behaved than truck drivers, and certainly there's no need for architects to be better behaved than truck drivers. Sophisticated cultured France is not necessarily better than simple materialistic America. It's also one of the arguments out there. And well, I'll talk about this in a minute, but Marxist leaders did not do much to redress the essential fatuousness of this kind of binary theory. In fact, the historical records concerns that socialism is not necessarily better for minorities than capitalism, and the party in power is not necessarily having working people and the educated people. Interestingly enough, if you go around, the cabinet government with the most PhDs that ever existed, in other words, where I think it was 8 out of 10 people had PhDs, was the Dr. Malane's nationalist government that set up apartheid in South Africa. They were all PhDs from Heidelberg or Stanford. So there's a paradigm shift here, and we see it sometimes even in the media in Britain. The British Jewish community has had more complaints against the Observer and the Independent and the New Statesman about anti-Semitic defamation than it has about the one that produced lots of naked women, like the Sun and the News of the World or the Daily Express. The kind of newspapers for the lower orders are less likely to be accused of anti-Semitism these days than the broadsheets. Which again, is an interesting kind of postmodernist situation. So let me talk about ideas. The realm of ideas in the mind. Ideas, I think, are crucial to explaining part of the problem of the efficacy of hate. Right? Ideas are what people have always been prepared to live, kill, and die for. The famous economist, picking on economists because it's not often that you find them with ideas, John Maynard Keynes suggested that ideas, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. I am sure the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared to the gradual encroachment of ideas. That's John Maynard Keynes in the 30s. Now, going to another extreme, Nietzsche claimed that the root of political psychology is resentment, right? Resentment. And that it was a distinguishing social emotion of modern societies, the genealogy of morals. He wrote that in 1899. His thesis, that's Nietzsche's thesis, was that other people or groups' success breeds resentment. And resentment, in turn, breeds hate. It's a passion bound up with the identity of one who feels it and feels this resentment. And he rejoices, therefore, in damaging others by virtue of their membership of a targeted group which is relatively successful. Don't have to be very successful, more than the person there, but anybody, if you get an B and somebody else gets an A, you resent it. The particularity, of course, in insecure epochs in history is that hatred has a function in the historical, if you might call it political, societal arena, not as micro. Both Nietzsche and some of the other people say the resentment thesis works at the micro level, right, interpersonal, but also at the societal level, right? But at the societal level, when it's harnessed by political thinkers, it brings order out of chaos and decision out of uncertainty. So you're going to get this thing coming up much more, coming back to the original thesis of economic upheaval and societal upheaval. Revolutionary times are going to bring this out, this psychological construct out in the population and in the body politic. Okay, so what can we say about universities? I mean, one of the interesting things coming back to ideas, I think French essayist Julien Benya, La Trahison des clercs. In 1927, before the time of nationalist wars and the beginning of fascism and certainly political extremism, he accused the intelligentsia of being traitors to the cause, especially to the Enlightenment project that Adam Smith was referring to, right? And this is his quote: abandoning their traditional panoply of philosophical and scholarly ideals whereby for centuries they had exhorted men to deaden the feeling of their differences and instead come to support and favour the intellectual organisation of political hatreds. And he was really going for people like fascist D'Annunzio and people like that in Italy and some of the German intellectuals who had associated themselves with nationalist movements or far extreme movements at the time. Now, so the argument there is, again, kind of part of that liberal value system. He defines intellectuals as people whose function was to defend eternal and disinterested values, like justice and reason, right? Now, Martin Heidegger, and Hitler came to power and wrote his letter and all this, saying, ending out the Heil Hitler, is not really, doesn't seem to be invoking those disinterested values. And so that, you could say that, already the German universities, the Austrian universities, University of Poland, certainly most of Europe, this was totally out of phase already. I mean, he's right in his criticism. But the intellectuals were the guiding force of many of the hatred that was going on. Not only against Jews, but against neighbours as well. So, one fact that is often glossed over is that in interwar Europe, in Austria and Germany, the Nazis controlled the universities before they controlled the streets or the organs of government. Right? The Germans was Nazi before the faculty, and then the faculty was Nazi before the Berlin government, the Reich. Looking back in history, what stands out, of course, is the conspicuous absence of resistance by means of strikes and student protests to the mass expulsion of Jewish students and staff from universities. Right? And our intellectuals in the driving force. We have to understand it. Take, again, coming back to my thing about apartheid. Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, PhD in literature and philosophy from Heidelberg at age 24. Sort of wunderkind, right? Not exactly an uneducated, street thug. Don Hagen suggests in his book, Hitler's Willing Execution, knows that some elements of the Einsatzgruppen, like he says, generally were a better class of German. Right? High proportion of university graduates amongst many of the Nazi fanatics and the psychopaths, especially. You get this skewed profile together today in amongst some of the suicidal and homicidal Islamist terrorists, right? I don't know if you recently noticed in Dhaka, Bangladesh, there was an attack on a cafe. They seized hostages and murdered, I've forgotten how many people that. Anyway, the 6 hostage takers in Dhaka, Bangladesh were all well-born in university graduates. Right? It was recently terrorist incidents. If you go to the UK figures, government figures, 47% of convicted terrorists in Britain since 2001 have attended university. That's above the average of the country. Right? 6 convicted terrorists were presidents of their Islamic societies at the university. I think Aris Rafiq is coming here. He'll give you more of this. Okay, so going to university does not necessarily make you a great lover of the world. All right, but did anybody think about this in the past? Any ideas? Who was prescient? During the German Aufklärung, well-known scientist George Christoph Lichtenberg suggested an aphorism. This is in the 18th century, at the time of the Enlightenment. Today we are trying to spread knowledge everywhere. Who knows if in centuries to come there will not be universities for re-establishing our former ignorance. And there's again a kind of psychological thing, an assessment of human nature. Now, as I say, you've got a famous scientist of the 18th century, and to some extent you could see that working in the 1920s and 30s, and maybe some people would say to that. But the issue about education, of course, is that it has a cognitive and an affective aspect, right? Knowledge is probably a good thing, but by themselves, ideas are neither good nor bad. They're neutral. It's through their application and the combination between the two that ideas can become either good or deleterious. It's an underappreciated problem, especially in modernity, the linkage of knowledge to bad ideas. Right? One could claim the most dangerous people, coming back to Maynard Keynes, who said it's like people with ideas, therefore, Keynes, is not just soldiers or scientists, but philosophers and ideologues. Right? Now, do we have any historical evidence? I'm only going on other people's territory here, but I'll talk about history. The 19th century, it was the intelligentsia who sought to reverse what they saw as illegitimate and unwarranted intrusions of Jews into European culture. In a peculiar way, and the most pretty unpredictable, it will be in the area of music. Right? The composers Richard Wagner, Franz Liszt, excoriated their Jewish peers Mendelssohn, Offenbach, and Mahler, claiming that the Jewish music undermined the purity of European civilization. Wagner's pamphlet, Das Judentum und die Musik, was published anonymously in 1850 because it was regarded so crazy, contained what we got a pretty lunatic idea, right? Banning and boycotting of Jewish composers, and expulsion even of Jewish violinists from orchestras, right? Now, 1850s, 1870s, people thought it was lunatic. In 1933, it became state policy. No more Jewish composers, and the Berlin and then eventually the Vienna Philharmonic got rid of their Jewish members, their musicians. So it happens in the, even in the citadels of classical music. It's amazing that these kind of ideas can penetrate to that level. Right? Now, of course, probably the problem resides in, say, unenlightened or retrograde centres of higher education. Where do they come from? Well, if you look at, especially the German universities, they were sort of nurturing places for extreme nationalism. Take the very famous historian, 19th century, professor at the University of Berlin, Heinrich von Treitschke. Right? 1879, he takes the idea, recoins the phrase that was used, of course, by Martin Luther. So we got the regurgitation of classic kind of anti-Judaism and put it into a nationalist German modern context. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. the Jews are our misfortune. 50 years later, this identical phrase is a slogan and a rallying cry, of course, in the Stürmer, the Nazi Party newspapers on the banner, and inspires, to inspire the stormtroopers. Now, if you're a postmodernist, I guess you would classify such a thing as a coincidence. It's significant that the editor and publisher of this paper, named Julius Streicher, was tried at Nuremberg and executed for crimes against humanity. Right? But the interesting thing is Streicher never killed anybody. Right? So why was he executed? Very interesting. In the words of the prosecution, Streicher was convicted of poisoning the minds of a generation. Right? It's a resounding endorsement of Keynes' axiom about the power of ideas. It's equally important to note this innovation in international law, because it was accepted by at least the tribunes at that time that ideas and words have consequences. Incitement to hatred and advocacy of murder and genocide is as much a crime as actually carrying it out itself. And that became the kind of basis for all the kind of race relations, crime, criminal stuff that we've got in Canada and Britain and I guess the United States as well. The kind of criminality of criminalizing hatred, words as well as action. Now, once we understand that these ideas are freestanding and powerful, I think we gain an indispensable tool for combating kind of the insidious arguments that the victims call the hatred, right? Jewish behavior, and this is a big issue, I guess, can and does affect the arguments and the narratives of their enemies, right? No doubt about it. Yet this recognition does not mean that the actions and behaviours of Jews, rather than their simple existence, causes anti-Semitism. Yet, for historians, I guess, and for others maybe, the big uncomfortable question is, what is the role of the Jews collectively in this whole question of anti-Semitism? They can't be blamed for anti-Semitism, but do they have agency? Right? Do the Jews have agency in these societies? Right? Are they totally passive targets, or do they have agency? Which then leads to the rather awkward question, why are the Jews singled out for bad treatment over millennia? Are they just kind of unlucky, right, in the wrong place at the wrong time, or many places at the wrong time? That way, why do Jews seem to run counter to contemporary popular dominant worldviews, whether it's Hellenism, or Christianity, or Islam, or Protestantism, the Enlightenment, nationalism, race theory, post-nationalism, anti-colonialism, international law culture, human rights agenda? Somehow it's not good for the Jews, or it turns against them. Now, you might say that, so we have to accept that when we're studying anti-Semitism, we're going to have to follow this kind of argument because it's the counter-argument. Does the value system of the Jewish tradition play a role in this kind of victimization? Historically, from ancient times, Jews, as noted by both Moses and Tacitus, have been an obstinate and stiff-necked people, unwilling to bend to fashion and majority opinions. Now, if you look over history, the Jewish tradition does produce more than its fair share of skeptics, naysayers, and, interestingly enough, zealots. Opposing ideologies seem to implicitly reject a value system promoted by the Jews. Not all the time. I remember going to I was at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Lisbon in 1881. I was told I had to go and meet with Salo Baron by Professor Bach. So I had a few sessions with Salo Baron and interchanges there with Eisenstadt and Baron, who the whole question of sort of this lachrymose view of Jewish history or not, and of course it's not always been terrible. That was Salo Baron's view, and he's correct. The history of the Jews is not the history of anti-Semitism. I think it's very important that we put that on the table as well. But there does seem to be the Jews seem to be involved often in what we might call a conflict model, as proposed by German sociologist and liberal politician Ralph Dahrendorf. Darendorf also asserted that there has to be consensus in society. The way you get consensus in society, especially modern societies, is through conflict, right, or conflicting ideas. So there has to be two prerequisites for each other. The opposite is also true. Conflict can result in cohesion and consensus. Now, his view was that conflict in society, if it's within bounds of the legal system, is good. So he's describing modern societies, but it's applicable to most fields. The presence of the other, right? The presence of the other reinforces dominant group solidarity, right? You need there's a boundary there, right? So for the good of the whole of society, it's necessary to have another there, right? A more homogeneous society, right? The only way people know they're finished is if people who aren't finished are in Finland, right? Otherwise they're just members of classes, they're members of groups or anything else, right? It's only when you look across the border into Russia that you realize that you're finished, right? Because if you're in Finland in a homogeneous society, it's not really relevant. Now, how do we, therefore, this othering, if you want to call it that, is of course, the persistence of one particular form is anti-Semitism. It's particularly, as we would say here, pernicious form of prejudice and racism that's been manifested across time and space. So that's the problem. Why over such a long period? We can draw explanations, as I've tried to show, from a number of academic disciplines. You can look at politics, sociology, economics, psychology, anthropology, theology, literature, as well as history, all of which have a part to play or a contribution to make to the overall understanding of this topic. Now, what about politics? Writers from Karl Marx to the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society, gives the game away, believe that political opinions are inevitably rooted in economic interests of some kind or other. So there's a theologian coming back to that socio-economic model, because he was writing at the time when that was very popular. Now, however, I think the historical record suggests that class analysis is not completely sufficient to explain everything. Political opinions can arise, as we've seen, from religious and philosophical commitments. Cultural origins, social aspirations, diverse animosities don't necessarily have economic roots. In fact, Niebuhr in the race problem contends that racism is located in, quote, group consciousness, the inveterate tendency among men to generalize about individuals in another group on the basis of the least favorable evidence in regard to them. So it's not this, Nietzsche's idea that you're jealous. It's that people automatically see out groups and will go for the negative, right? So I guess one way of looking at this would be, should we look at anti-Semites? Are they positive? Are they optimists or pessimists, right? Pessimists are more likely to be anti-Semitic or prejudiced. This view of intergroup relations is very close to the social psychologist, coming back to where I started, Henri Tajfel's social identity theory, that came out in 1974. The tendency towards in-group, out-group bias, whether based on ethnicity and class, is also very evident in Marx's Jugendfrage. And a series of anti-Semitic tracts by William Houston Chamberlain from the right, John Hobson, Charles Maurras, Hitler, right? All have this same concept. Apart from their espousal of hatred and defamation, these works are notable for their search, also, all of them, for human perfectionism, a kind of political utopianism. I would contend, and this is where I'm going to go now, is that it's utopian idealism, a kind of fondness for monism, as well as professing, which often has a preference for totalitarianism, are covariants of anti-Semitism. And this explains much of its present and past appeal to intellectuals and academics who are rooted in the Christian West and the Muslim lands. It's utopian idealism, right? The creation of a perfect society. And it's a kind of messianism, right? So, one of the debates, I guess, that's going to come up always, and any time we want to bring this to a university or anything else, is the whole question, which we know is around all the time, is the relationship of anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, right? Is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Now, to understand that, we have to all think about the origins of anti-Zionism, have to deal with that, to be able to place it in a context which associates it, if you want, with anti-Semitism. And to do that, you have to understand you have to touch, for any course, the ideology and practice of Marxism and left-wing anti-Semitism. Now, I assume most of you are familiar with the arguments of Marx in the Jugendfrage, as well as early revolutionary socialists like Blanqui and Proudhon, right? Who looked after the working class but weren't particularly favourable towards Jews. But you know, you're going to be told right from the outset there's a difference between economic class-based anti-Semitism and biological racism, right? They are two different forms. And the issue is, are there anti-Semitisms? Is there one, right? So, undoubtedly, or is anti-Zionism the kind of class-based anti-Semitism? Now, each individual Jew obviously was responsible for Germany's and Europe's and the world's misery, right? According to Nazi biological race theory. Roosevelt was right. But biological anti-Semitism, quite logically, I think, as a kind of intellectually logic, requires a genocidal solution. It talks about cancer. If you take a biological model or a biomedical model, you want to eradicate the disease. It's quite obvious. I think there is a trajectory there. However, class-based anti-Semitism logically offers a different and quite logically a less murderous prospect. Now, the logical targets for eradication, if this is Judaism as a religion or Zionism as a political philosophy, are the institutions and their leadership, not necessarily the congregants and the followers. Their minds can be changed, right? They can be converted politically or religiously to something else. So you don't have to eradicate the whole Jewish population, you just get rid of the ruling class. So the assault on religious and political institutions, of course, obviously, revolutionary, does involve a little bit of violence, or maybe some few deaths, but it's not inevitable, and it's certainly not genocidal. In some ways, it's very similar, and again, you can see, it comes out. You think socialism as an outgrowth of Marxism, an outgrowth of the Enlightenment. It comes straight out of the philosophe French Enlightenment tradition. Advocates the eradication of backward religious cult, right, Judaism, but however offers the Jews equality through assimilation as French citizens or as Homo Sovieticus, right, the new Soviet man. Forget your past and embrace the present and the new, and you're okay as an individual at least. Cultural traditions have to be phased out of this. So socialism, the movement to liberate workers by hand and brain, has of course deep intellectual roots, held a particular attraction for Western and Third World academics and artists and intellectuals. Now, what is it? Think about it. It's based on a scientific analysis of human history that claims and seeks equality and fraternity. So who can be against that? However, democratic socialists in practice praise social reformers like in Britain, the kind of moderate social democratic people, Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw, were not averse to expressing prejudice and hostility against Jews and immigrants. Even then, the people who were really versed in it, in their own private lives, found it very difficult to keep their personal prejudices out, although they saw themselves very much as political animals. You could say from its infancy, the left and the Labour Party of Britain has not been immune to anti-Semitism, which explains to some extent the problem you have today with Corbyn and the Labour Party, right? In Britain, it's an underlying tradition which has been around. Proudhon and Marx. However, you know, the key factor for understanding anything about anti-Zionism or progressive left-wing thought is we have to turn to the USSR. For 70 years, the Soviet Union was the fount of worldwide socialists, and at times rather progressives, for their dreams, for prestige, for power, and for much of the funding for comrades all over the world. Now, this fact is central to understanding the background to the present debate, I think, surrounding the state of Israel. The great socialist revolution experiment that took place in the Soviet Union in 1917 was in a state with a population of several million Jews. Therefore, the Jewish question, or a Jewish question, was a practical policy concern to the new Bolshevik government. Right? Unluckily for the Jews, nationalities policy fell to the Commissar for Nationalities, Joseph Stalin, organized. Comrade Vladimir Ilyich gave Joseph this job. Now, there may have been some personal animus in Stalin's policies. So it's not only, and some people say this, some of his early rivals, but also his later rivals like Trotsky were Jewish. But to begin with, I don't think it was so personal. But, you know, think about Stalin's background. His first job for the party, of course, was as a bank robber. That was his first job, because his job was to expropriate the expropriators, and that's how he became, proving his mettle for the party. But, so it was a little bit of a thug to begin with. But to understand beforehand what he had, he of course was a seminarian of Georgia, of the Orthodox Church, which is not the most enlightened as regards, it has what we might call classic Christian views of the Jews. So he was exposed to that, the anti-Jewish theological arguments and prejudices of the Orthodox Church. So his essay, which really became a Soviet policy, is 1913, for the revolution, Marxism and the National Question. And Stalin, in this pamphlet, firmly denied the status of nationhood to the Jews. Now, I guess some of you, if you haven't studied Marx himself made a distinction between what he called historical and ahistoric nations, right? So the Czechs and the Poles are historic nations entitled to nation states, but the Slovaks and the Romanians and the kind of people, they weren't really entitled to nation states. There was a kind of, in those days, Marx believed in hierarchies. And so Stalin's applying that concept of who's entitled to their own country, their own state, to Soviet groups. So not the Ukrainians, really, but the Georgians, obviously, because they'd had a state before. Probably the Poles should have something. The Armenians definitely should have a state. But the Jews don't fit the model. So he denies that because they failed to meet what he called his scientific criteria. Very important, scientific criteria. Use the word use all the time in the Soviet system. But however, because of the political exigencies of the time, the basis, and Lenin's softness, the Jews were recognized as a minority, as a national minority in the Soviet Union, mainly on the basis of the opposing idea that it's not historical, really a nationalist, European nationalist concept of language. The Jews had a unique language called Yiddish, and only they spoke it, and therefore they are a folk group, right? And therefore they are a nation. So the Jews were recognized, however, as a non-territorial minority. Everybody else had a republic, but the Jews had a non-territorial until 1937, when Azerbaijan comes along and they try to make Far East. Yeah, in the Far East. They try to give them a home so that they're not unique and picked on. So the reality is that Evray appeared on every Jewish Soviet citizen's identity card. And of course, you had the peculiarities, which we had to deal with in the 70s and later, but Evray, like all Soviet nationalities, is passed down through the father, right? Not halakhic definition. So it led to great games about people going to Israel, as we know today. But so a Jew is somebody who is in the paternal line Jewish under the Soviet system. But what having these individual identity cards, of course, recognises that anybody, every time you meet a public official, you've got Jew written on something, okay? Which can either, if they're Jewish, I guess might help you get a job, but in most cases is a mechanism with potential for discrimination, right? If you carry an identity. So what we might call the official cognitive and bureaucratic system provided a mechanism for persecution. And of course it helped the Nazi invasion in 1941, that's how they could find out he's Jewish, especially even amongst the Soviet prisoners of Red Army prisoners of war. So you could have, and it allowed for a kind of the opportunities for numerous classes in higher education, narrowing employment opportunities, bans against Jews later in the Foreign Service and after the 50s in the Foreign Armed Services, and it as well as a kind of time-honoured method of purging what they used to call deviationists from records, right? So if you had the wrong card, you were likely to be called a deviationist in a record. And it is, it was used by the 80s under Brezhnev. The Soviet Union reintroduced the numerous classes. In Moscow State University, Jews could not be more than 2% of the population, right? Worse than Harvard in the Clintons. Now, the point that needs to be emphasized here is this Soviet Union, the Marxist-Leninist Third International, which is led, and that's important to know, at these branches everywhere, was an ideological movement based, again, intellectually, on theoretically argued texts, right? That was scientific assessment by Stalin. Anti-Zionism was the official policy. A great deal of attention was given over decades to arguing the case against Zionism as a reactionary movement, and against, later, against the policies and practices of the State of Israel. There was a vast library of books and leaflets and historical and theoretical articles and speeches denouncing Zionism in Israel over 40 or 50 years, and they spewed out of what was known as the Foreign Languages Publishing House in Moscow, that did all the publishing in 120 languages or something to spread the word. As we noted, the Soviet policy was actually to use the Jews, because they were a non-territorial minority, they wanted to create this new Soviet man, probably woman as well. The Jews were a test case for the assimilatory policies and the eradication of what we might call outdated loyalties and decadent culture. And they had the Sextia, the Jewish section of the Communist Party was there to help them. And their big gesture, even though the Jews were recognized as a territorial minority, the Jewish communists were the ones who made the first sacrifice and closed down Yiddish language schools in the late 20s. There were Jewish schools in the Soviet Union, but they were closed on the initiative of the as a fraternal gesture by the Jewish section of the Communist Party. And the eradication of Yiddish language journals and things like that was slowly brought in. But they would become, and they were very successful. It was, interestingly enough, a continuation of the Tsarist policy of Russification. Right? So today, of course, the Soviet Jews in Israel, they speak Russian, they speak Yiddish, it's no thing. I remember when I was involved with the American Jews who said, oh, we've got to find somebody, these new Americans didn't study and all these people coming to New York. And they say, oh, we've got to find somebody to speak Yiddish. Of course, none of these people speak Yiddish, they only use Russian. Tucked from Dagestan or wherever they came from. They do nothing. So the Soviets were successful in Russifying the Jewish population by the 1970s. And Russian became the socialist language, like English became, become the international language of business. Right? So, but however, it's very important to realize it's different from Nazi ideology and policies. Now, interestingly, the Nazis also believed in pseudo-scientific racism and also said they were scientists, right? That's the modern aspect of all this. So it wasn't Jewish pollution of the nation, it was just that Jewish pollution of themselves that they really were worried about. they, they were definitely enthusiastic. They denounced Jewish class and religious trades, and on occasions fell back into classic, Jew baiting. But and they had unofficial historic anti-Semitic arguments, which the Nazis might have been happy about. But one piece that was very popular, I don't know if you all know about this, but they turned to one particular publication, which Lenin loved, said it was his favourite book, or the one that was most inspiring, which was Hobson's Imperialism. Right? They put Hobson's Imperialism. John Hobson. This is a book from a British socialist, written at the time of the South African War, 1899 actually. And he spends a lot of time about Jewish bankers, German Jewish bankers who were the agents of British imperialism, pauperizing the world and doing terrible things to the Boers of South Africa. It emphasized a kind of conspiracy theory that echoed some of the protocols of the Elder Zion. Now, you might say this, the fact that that was Lenin's favourite book meant that they pushed this book out tremendously in the third world colonial countries. I remember in 1966, something like that, I was an undergraduate. I went to the University of Zambia, in Lusaka. The university just opened there about 2 years before, because they just got independence. And hardly anything in the library, one copy of Shakespeare, everything. And on one shelf, there were a lot of empty shelves, there were 20 copies of Hobson's Imperialism that had been given a gift from Moscow. Okay? So, even sophisticated communist theorists and intellectuals who taught third world developing countries, the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow is very important in this whole question of anti-Zionism. Even the theorists and intellectuals there found it difficult to even if you look at what was coming out in the 80s and 90s, the 80s especially, the demarcation line between what they believed was legitimate, vehement criticism of Israel and real anti-Semitism. And lots of third world leaders were going to Moscow. But however, whenever anybody accused the Soviets, Western, when they were attacked by Western Jewry, the Soviet apologists, both everywhere in the world, fell back on theology to argue about this. Now, Lenin, as you know, had defined anti-Semitism as spreading the hostility to, as, quote, spreading hostility to Jews and a diversionary tactic of capitalists. Following Babel's point out there, socialism is false, right? Lenin believed Babel was correct, and it was a diversionary tactic. And so the USSR, actually wasn't the USSR, it was the Russian Soviet Federal Republic, was the first in the world to legislate against anti-Semitism. It was a criminalized anti-Semitism under the 1922 Criminal Code. Anti-Semitism was made an offense in the in Russia, the Russian state, and eventually spread in a later constitution to the whole of the USSR. Now, we've got a criminal code against anti-Semitism, and of course, a socialist state couldn't be anti-Semitic because the Soviet Union, under their theology, was an example of tolerance and fraternal internationalism. Now, that's a trope that is out there all the time. If today the UK Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn and other, people of far left ideas would say that it's impossible for a socialist to be anti-Semitic, right? It just doesn't fit the model, right? To be fraternal. And undoubtedly, it was an inhibition to the Soviet Union, right? And the Soviet leaders. It was difficult for the Soviet leadership to embrace open government policy of classic anti-Semitism, whatever the personal inclinations of the Politburo members. So, how did they do it? They replaced it with anti-Zionism. That became the favoured alternative term, and it sort of buttressed them or protected them from this whole question of anti-Semitism. And again, they would make the point. Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is not about an immutable personal characteristic. It doesn't threaten each individual Jew, but only Jews who think incorrectly. Right? In fact, anti-Zionism could be and was embraced by good communists and other Marxist revolutionaries of Jewish extraction, who was willing to denounce other Jews for their sins. And because those Jews had been duped by capitalism, imperialism, religion, or other forces. So, the anti-Zionist propaganda material, which was disseminated by agitprop, you don't hear that word today, agitprop departments of communist parties, really, and the fraternal and the front organisations and fellow travellers, became a central plank in the litany of grievances and accusations against the evil ways of Western imperialism and colonialism. And it's been around for 70 years, 60 or 70 years. It's not a new thing in part. Now, the USSR, interestingly enough, I guess everybody knows this peculiar period after World War II when Stalin recognises the state because suddenly somebody persuades him it will help with efforts against British imperialism, and therefore he allows the Czechs to take planes to Israel in the War of Independence. Because the Czechs, Red Army controls the airfields in Prague, and planes couldn't get out without Russian help. But then, within 2 years he's got doctor's plots and all this kind of stuff. So he changes his mind. But they never outrightly called for the extinction of the state of Israel. They never had that. Trotskyists and other revolutionary leftist groups have been less inhibited and much fiercer in their Zionist rhetoric and agitation. And therefore that was one of the battles between the 70s, between the old left and the new left. The old left said, Israel within borders and all the rest of it, as long as it was kibbutz, Israel within the green lines was okay. The new left, however, Israel was unacceptable under any circumstances, or most circumstances. And therefore you get these revolutionary groups, less inhibited, fiercer. And during the 70s, which again I think is a classic period for understanding what's going on today, those groups produced the first round of anti-Jewish terror. Bader Meinhof, the Red Brigades, Carlos the Jackal, they went through this kind of power of idea of anti-Zionism into active partnership in the armed struggle alongside, as we know, Palestinian militants, Abu Nidal, and attacks on Jews and Israelis across the world, and the outrage, they were part of history. In Teddy, the Munich Olympics, planes going up here and there, being bombed. But that's all part of that. But you've got to understand what the provenance of these ideas are. Now you could turn around and say, well, it's not just the Soviets. What about, the French intellectuals who weren't necessarily socialists? You read Michael Curtis in Verdict on Vichy. He shows that, sort of French intelligentsia of the left went down tacit support for bigotry and kind of collaborated or weren't very, shall we say, revolutionary or particularly involved in movements against the Vichy regime. Jews were boycotted in France, assets confiscated, Jews moved from public life. And if you look at prominent writers, André Gide, Paul Claudel, François Mauriac, Jules Romain, Roger Martin Ligard, even Aldro Malraux until 1944, the rule of all these writers in Vichy France, right, even in the unoccupied areas, the silence or inaction. Okay, when this was happening to the lesser known fact that Curtis brings up is that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, quite liberal icons in the post-war era. The heroic Simone de Beauvoir actually got a job on cultural program for Radio Nationale in occupied Paris. He was on the Vichy radio. And our friend Jean-Paul Sartre happily replaced a dismissed Jewish professor of philosophy. So it gives you an idea of how deep this kind of, I would say, distancing of the other of the Jew was toward Europe. And of course the liberal professors know better. It was only in 1999 that the French medical profession apologized that the basic values of their profession had been violated when they acquiesced in legislation discriminated against Jews. And Jews, of course, in France from 1942 were banned from practicing medicine. Right? And the French medical establishment went along with it. Okay, so let me talk about now, why that's an interesting point. What is it about, is there something about individual psychology or development psychology that allows people to somehow rationalize these kinds of things, which apparently on paper they disagree with it. Oh, sorry. Okay. I hope this one's not working. In addition to members of intelligence, utopian idealism appeals particularly, as we've seen, to young revolutionists. So these ideas come in. Young revolutionists, fascist, Marxist, Islamist revolutionaries who carry out the terrorism or violence thing, or they join these militias, right, are always young adults. Now the interesting thing here from a development psychology point of view is they're all the same age as the people between the age who go to universities. And psychologist last week came to visit my office from Haifa, he, by the left-wing guy, but the point was we were discussing this whole question of young men, and undoubtedly there is the proclivity for violence, because of genes and the other hormones and everything else. If you look at it all, 18 to 25-year-old men are particularly problematic. Maybe going back a few more years now. But by the time they reach 30, they calm down. They're much less involved with crime and violence and things like that. So there is a kind of developmental psychological process. Now, if you're a politician, somehow you might, understand this. Think about it. These movements appeal to this younger generation. The Nazis were the young people. Mussolini's fascist anthem was Venezia, right? Youth. A hymn to youth was the fascist song. So we can postulate, I think, a developmental factor at work. There's a desire among young people to create a new order. I'm going to talk, I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, but cultural and artistic areas, realms, appeal to young people. If you think about it, Italian fascism, the younger generation, Italian fascism was associated with the whole futurism, right? It's artistic and architecture and the melding of science and design, really. Italian futurism, there was a very big exhibition in New York 2 years ago, Italian futurism. And they were terribly involved in it. They all got government commissions from Mussolini's government, and they're all involved in that. There's kind of D'Annunzio's kind of romanticism, and it was very much sort of modernist Italian art. The point is, why are the Jews at the target of these utopian idealists across this political spectrum? You might even say, well, what's the cultural representation of Jews in opposition to this? In art, literature, film, if you look at it, you might give some ideas that people have raised this in discussions. They've all said, well, it's always the old Jew, right? The image of the Jew in the world of culture and media and everything is an elderly Jewish man, right? Often a rabbi with a beard or something like that. So if the Jew represents and is associated with the past, he's also associated with its failures and disappointments. Right? So coming back, if there's a resentment there, it could be a resentment of the past, a fear of maybe some parts, a fear of the future. That might be a motivating antipathy towards the Jew, who symbolizes both tradition and, to many nationalists on the right, peculiarly, it's always the antithesis, the Jew symbolizes both tradition and the failures of the past, but also and history, but also the Jew is subversive because they seem to embrace change as well. Right? So you've got the Jew is caught between the two things. But I think this involvement with art and culture is very important to understand some of the appeal of anti-Semitism. Utopian idealism is attracted towards embracing and utilising art and culture in the furtherance of its wider goals. So, we have to understand the mindset of totalitarian ideologies, which I associate very much with anti-Semitism. If you look at National Socialism, that also it features in communism, Marxism, Leninism. Totalitarian ideologies have a complete system of thought and behaviour set out by the ideologues of the one-party state, and the population has to follow that in order to achieve the utopian vision of the party leaders. The system brooks no criticism or deviation. It knows the truth, and anyone who disagrees is either mad or evil, right? So, Soviet, if you remember the big problems the Soviet psychiatrists had getting international acceptability in the West in the 1990s and 80s, because they were so involved in putting people away from mental hospitals, right? Anybody, sort of large numbers of political activists were obviously mad, and they signed the order. And they'll be treated accordingly. The culture and the arts, in fact, are an essential part of the system. And that's how you get the message out. So every one of these countries, of course, unlike the United States, one or two other countries, France has one, have ministries of culture, right? There's a ministry of culture, right? You agree? And often Britain doesn't have a ministry, but they have a ministry of the arts, but not culture. Now, what does a ministry of culture do in an ideological totalitarian state? It censors, it polices, sponsors, and directs the production of the visual arts, literature, film, and, interestingly enough, going back to Darwin, even music, right? Jazz is dangerous to certain systems. Culture and cultural production is an arm of the state and the party. Its function is to educate, to socialise the population, and in the case of Germany, to, of course, glorify the folk, and in the case of Soviet Union, glorify the proletariat, right? So, you go to the, I don't know what it's like today in Russia, but, in the old days, it was, everywhere you went, local art gallery, it was socialist realism, right? It was the artistic painting, really. And it was usually somebody cutting some crops or, working a machine or something. So, now, it's very important to realise that the Nazis are absolutely obsessed with art, right, and culture. And they're very involved. And it's difficult for people. They put over some kind of Hell's Angels with armbands and all the rest of it. But it's not the way they really were in principle. They were, they were a criminal gang, but they weren't Hell's Angels. They're not the nihilist. They weren't even nihilistic as much as the Taliban and the ISIS. They weren't destroying things without creating them. I guess in Russia they saw today, especially, or in the past, they saw themselves as products of a civilized nation, especially the Germans saw themselves. Kultur und Bildung. Art was an essential component of this human spirit. And of course, the Nazis came to power legally and constitutionally. They got the youth vote, particularly popular amongst the intelligentsia, except for those the Jews and the communists. And most of the intelligentsia embraced this utopian idealism and this, opportunity to serve the state through art. And I was, teaching, I would say, who was Hitler's favourite protege? Was he an SS man, some kind of killer? No. Who was it? It was Albert Speer, one of Germany's most brilliant intellectuals, right? University professor, architect. And when he had to take one person with him to Paris, when he conquered Paris in 1940, who did he take with him? Right? All the generals were already there. It was Albert Speer, he told. So Albert Speer could look at the city and then decide what he could apply to Hitler's idea, Hitler's new city, Germany. Right? This is, good stuff. And of course, Speer, became the armament minister and eventually sort of employer of vast numbers of slave labourers. But, he didn't see himself as he was very effective in his PR and escaped the hangman. But, the fact is the Nazi leaders were not fools, were uneducated, as I said, Goebbels has a PhD in literature, They saw them as connoisseurs and arbiters of culture. You know, Goering's a kleptocrat, right? But he's stealing good art, right? he's still, you know, what he steals has got some value. You know, they were in the business. So I think, however, coming back is the kind of circle here to the, you know, the psychological profile of these guys. I don't think you can understand German Nazi history without understanding the place of the Wagner cult. Right? The Wagner cult is very important. And that links to a guy called Kosmin Chamberlain, who was a British person who became German. And interestingly, Kosmin Chamberlain began his march towards Germany and everything because he had a particular personal hatred for British Conservative Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. The first thing he ever writes is he doesn't like Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli is really great. He's a great imperialist, but somehow Benjamin Chamberlain thought he was a spy and a traitor. Queen Victoria didn't think so. Chamberlain was an eccentric, but he accomplished, you know, as a folkish intellectual. He was started out as a botanist. Wrote on Kant and Goethe and Hinduism and Wagner. And his book is very important. He wrote this book in 1899, which is known as the Grundlagen, the Foundations of the 19th Century. Claimed all the achievements of the West were products of the Aryan race. Everything negative in the West was due to the Jews. Right? Everything negative was due. So what was the literal things that were due to the Jews? Well, the Catholic Church, which he didn't like, democracy, capitalism, and socialism, not only were invented, but were all controlled by the Jews still. The book, right, it's like an eccentric book, you know, sold 250,000 copies and was very popular on university campuses. He's invited in the 20s, even, to lecture on his racial ideas in America at Yale and Johns Hopkins. He turned them down because he wouldn't go to America because, you know who, it was controlled by. You know? It was already spiritually and culturally debased, America, so he could, you know, put his foot on the ground there. He was a propagandist for the Kaiser in World War I. He believed England and America had fallen into the hands of the Jews. More dangerously, he was the first one who claimed that Germany had been betrayed by an inner enemy. And that's the beginning of the stab in the back notion. So, again, Chamberlain was a very famous German. He was the first major intellectual to endorse Hitler in 1923, and the first intellectual to join the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Interestingly, when he died, tells you Hitler attended his funeral, which was unusual. That shows you how much he followed him. And it was in Bayreuth, which, you know, Bayreuth, which is, you know, Wagner's place. He chose to be buried in Bayreuth. All these things, you know, postmodernist coincidences occurring. The Nazi House intellectual Alfred Rosenberg was influenced by Chamberlain, and his work, The Myth of the 20th Century, was written out of homage to Chamberlain. Now, Chamberlain became obsessed with Wagner's redemptive anti-Semitism. He believed it would explain the world and would assist in the salvation of humanity. Right? The salvation of humanity. Chamberlain actually married into the Wagner and Liszt families. Of course, Wagner was Hitler's hero, and he had a tremendous influence on German music, philosophy, and the visual arts. Again, a very early anti-Semite. But of course, he's an evil genius, an epitome of the romantic tradition. I've spoken about the Nuremberg laws and how they removed the orchestras and the rest of it. Now, how does it all fit together? Hitler saw himself as an arbiter of culture. Hitler went to 24 full cycles of the Wagner operas. Right? Der Ring is Nibelungen. And the Bayreuth Festival became the annual gathering place for all of fascists in Europe, from Spain and Italy and Hungary and all these places. Just like you know, sort of the Third International, the Bayreuth Festival was that for the fascists. Of course, Wagner's widow, Kosmin, was the person who gave Hitler the paper in Schlossberg, Landsberg Castle in 23 to actually write Mein Kampf, right? Kosmin. Wagner's widow gave Hitler the writing paper to write Mein Kampf. When he was in prison, he couldn't get hold of any paper, she was lying came to his aid. And the assertion, this is the important bit, the assertion coming back, remember I said, Chamberlain said about stabbing the back. The assertion about the Jews stabbing Germany in the back in World War I comes directly from Chamberlain and from the Teutonic heroes Siegfried, who stabbed in the back by the wicked Untermenschen, the subhuman dwarves, the Negroes. And, you know, it comes out all the time. If you see a torchlight procession in Nuremberg in the late 30s, it's all the medieval symbolism that Wagner copied. And these ideas are important. They do work into the political, they give people the confidence to bring out their ideas generally. Now, I'm going to break. This is enough. And I'm just going to go back and just talk about quickly the rest of the psychological stuff after 10 minutes. I'm going to let you go to tea now.
So please be back at 11:30 sharp.
Well, thank you for staying with me.
Thank you.
What?